Close your eyes, dear dreamer, and breathe in the scent of old libraries, dust, beeswax, and the faint lavender tucked into ancient books. You're not just listening, you're there, a silent witness in a candlelit chamber where kings whisper treaties over marriage contracts and empires rise on the union of cousins. Imagine a world where love was a luxury, but blood was power, where a prince didn't choose his bride, his genealogy did, where a king might kiss his cousin at the altar, not from passion, but to keep a kingdom from crumbling. This is the hidden truth behind crowns and thrones. Cousin marriages weren't the exception, they were the rule. For centuries, Europe's royal families treated kinship like currency, weaving their bloodlines tighter and tighter in a desperate bid to hold on to power. Welcome to Why Cousin Marriages Were the Norm for Kings and Queens, a lullaby of dynasties, diplomacy, and quiet genetic tragedies, told in the softest whisper to ease your mind into rest. If this quiet corner of history brings you peace, we'd love to know. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Share in the comments. It's a gentle joy to picture our global circle of dreamers, tucked into beds from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And if these stories help you drift, a like or subscribe helps us keep the candles burning. Now, let the fire dim, let the world fade, and let us step into the gilded, inbred halls of royalty where family was fate. Close your eyes, dear listener, and breathe in the stillness. You're no longer in your room, not quite. You've slipped through time into a dimly lit chamber of a 15th century palace, perhaps in Burgundy or Flanders or some quiet corner of the Holy Roman Empire. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax from a single taper burning low on an oak desk, its flame flickering like a drowsy firefly. Shadows stretch across stone walls where tapestries hang heavy with age, woven in deep crimsons and golds, scenes of knights, saints, and solemn processions that seem to shift in the candlelight. A faint draught slips through the narrow window slit, carrying the distant chime of a monastery bell and the soft rustle of parchment turning under careful fingers. You are an archivist tonight, a quiet keeper of secrets. Your hands, ink-stained and steady, trace the delicate lines of a genealogical chart laid out before you, a sprawling, looping map of names, dates, and connections, drawn in faded iron gall ink. This is no ordinary family tree. It is a ledger of power, a balance sheet of blood, and as you lean closer, the quill poised above the parchment, you begin to understand. In this world, marriage was never about love. It was about economy, but not the kind measured in coins or grain. This was the blood economy, where lineage was currency and every cousin marriage was a calculated investment in survival. Long before banks, before stock markets, before even the idea of democracy, Europe's royal families operated under a different financial system. One where land, titles, divine right, and military alliances were all stored not in vaults, but in veins, in DNA. A king's strength wasn't just in his army or his castle, it was in his bloodline. And the safest way to protect that asset? Keep it within the family. Imagine a vast estate, rolling vineyards, fortified towns, forests teeming with game. Now imagine that estate divided among sons, nephews, cousins, in-laws. With each generation, the land shrinks, the power fragments, and soon the mighty dynasty becomes a scattering of minor nobles forgotten by history. To prevent this, kings and queens turned to a quiet, elegant solution. Marry your cousin. Not for romance, not for affection, but because a cousin, especially a first cousin, was safe. She, or he, came with no dangerous foreign ambitions, no scheming father waiting to seize power, no foreign army lurking beyond the border. A cousin was already part of the family. Her dowry, likely a few castles or a duchy already under your control. Her loyalty, assumed. Her blood, familiar. In this world, a royal marriage contract wasn't signed with a kiss. It was sealed with a wax stamp, often while the bride and groom were still children. A prince might be betrothed at 3, married at 14, and fathering heirs by 16, all before ever meeting his spouse. And more often than not, that spouse was his cousin. The logic was cold, but unshakable. If you marry a stranger from another kingdom, you risk everything. She might bring war. Her family might demand too much. Or worse, her children might inherit foreign loyalties. But if you marry your cousin, the blood stays pure, the wealth stays consolidated, the crown stays secure. This wasn't greed, it was survival. Think of it like a family business passed down through generations. If the founder's grandchildren start selling shares to outsiders, the company weakens. But if they keep it all in the family, son to daughter, nephew to niece, the legacy remains intact. For medieval monarchs, the company was a kingdom, and the shares were dukedoms, bishoprics, and armies. And so the practice spread, quietly, systematically, across Europe. The Habsburgs in Austria, the Bourbons in France, the Tudors in England, the Jagiellons in Poland, all built their empires on cousin marriages. Generation after generation, the family trees twisted in on themselves like vines trained too tightly around a trellis. Take the Habsburgs, for example. Their motto, Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, wasn't just poetic, it was policy. While other nations fought bloody battles for territory, the Habsburgs simply married into it. A daughter here, a nephew there, a double first cousin union in Spain, and suddenly half of Europe was under their rule. And how did they do it? By treating cousins not as relatives, but as strategic assets. In 1526, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. The wedding was a spectacle. Peacocks roasted in saffron, fountains flowing with wine, lutes playing through the night. But behind the celebration, the contract was clear. This union would merge Spanish and Portuguese imperial claims, giving the Habsburgs control over vast swaths of the New World. Gold from the Americas would now flow not just to Madrid, but to Vienna. And Charles wasn't some distant anomaly, he was the product of cousin marriages himself. His parents, Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, were double first cousins, meaning both sets of their grandparents were siblings. Their union wasn't scandalous, it was standard. The royal account books didn't record love, but legitimacy. And cousin marriages guaranteed that. But it wasn't just about empire building, it was about legitimacy. In a world where divine right ruled, a king's claim to the throne had to be unassailable. And what better way to prove your blood was pure than to marry within it? In England, the Tudors rose to power after the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between two branches of the same royal family, Lancaster and York. When Henry VII won the crown at Bosworth in 1485, he didn't just defeat his rival, he married him. He wed Elizabeth of York, his third cousin, uniting the warring houses in a single bloodline. The Tudor rose, half red, half white, was more than a symbol. It was a genetic merger. And though the Tudors didn't inbreed as intensely as the Habsburgs, the pattern was the same. Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the widow of his older brother, Arthur. That made her both his sister-in-law and, through distant lineage, a distant cousin. Later, he married Anne Boleyn, whose mother was a descendant of Edward III, making Anne a distant cousin as well. Even Jane Seymour had Plantagenet blood in her veins. Every wife was chosen not for beauty or charm, but for lineage. For the doors her ancestry could open, and the church, it didn't stop them. In fact, it enabled them. Canon law technically forbade marriages between close relatives, but for kings, there was always a loophole: the papal dispensation. For a price, often paid in land, loyalty, or military support, the Pope could bless a cousin marriage as if it were perfectly natural. The rules didn't apply to the anointed, so while a peasant might be excommunicated for marrying his second cousin, a king could marry his first cousin, twice removed, and have it celebrated in a cathedral with a cardinal presiding. This double standard wasn't hypocrisy, it was necessity. The Church understood that royal stability depended on controlled succession. A king with a clear, uncontested heir was less likely to be overthrown, and the safest way to ensure a legitimate heir: marry someone whose blood was already part of the royal line. But this system came at a cost, one that wouldn't be understood for centuries, because while cousin marriages protected wealth and power, they also concentrated something far more dangerous: genetic risk. You, the archivist, pause as your candle sputters. You dip your quill in ink, then turn the page. There, in the margin, you've sketched a simple diagram: two branches of a family looping back to meet again. A boy and a girl, both grandchildren of the same king, marrying each other. Their children carry double the chance of inheriting rare recessive genes. And if their children marry their cousins, the risk doubles again. But in the 15th century, no one knew this. There were no charts for DNA, no understanding of chromosomes. When a child was born with a cleft palate, or seizures, or an inability to speak, it was blamed on the stars, or God's will, or witchcraft, not on the fact that his parents were uncle and niece. And yet the signs were there. In Spain, Charles II of the Habsburgs, known as the Bewitched, was so physically and mentally impaired that he couldn't walk until he was 8, couldn't speak clearly, and was completely infertile. His jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew. He died at 38, childless, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. And why? Because his parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents? First cousins. His great-grandparents? Double first cousins. His entire genome was a hall of mirrors, so inbred that he was more genetically similar to a clone than a child of natural descent. But this wasn't seen as a warning, it was seen as bad luck. Back in your quiet chamber, you run a finger along the genealogical chart. You see the loops, the repetitions, the same names: Ferdinand, Philip, Charles, circling back through the centuries like ghosts. And you wonder, did any of them realize what they were doing? Did the mothers who dressed their daughters in silk for a wedding to a cousin, 10 years older, already balding, ever pause to think of the children they would produce? Did the kings signing marriage treaties by firelight ever consider that they were not just securing a dynasty, but slowly poisoning it? Perhaps not, because in their world, the alternative was worse. To marry outside the family was to risk chaos. A foreign queen might favour her homeland. A son-in-law from a rival house might lay claim to the throne. A bastard heir could spark a civil war. Better a sickly child with unquestionable blood than a healthy one with a disputed claim. And generation after generation, cousins married cousins. Not out of desire, but out of duty. The royal nursery became a factory for heirs, where playmates were future spouses, and bedtime stories were lessons in heraldry. You think of young Maria Theresa of Spain, married at 14 to her double first cousin, Louis XIV of France. She crossed the Pyrenees on a neutral island, leaving her home forever. The wedding was a triumph of diplomacy, the air filled with orange blossoms and the sound of trumpets. But she was alone, surrounded by strangers, speaking a language she barely knew, and within a year she was pregnant, and within a decade she was dead, all to keep the bloodline pure. This was the quiet tragedy of the blood economy. It worked until it didn't. Empires rose, thrones were secured, but the bodies of the heirs grew weaker, the minds more fragile, the lines more tangled, and when the end came, it came quickly. The French Revolution, the fall of the Bourbons, the execution of Louis XVI, himself the product of generations of cousin marriages. The Romanovs slaughtered in a basement in Ekaterinburg, their only crime being born into the wrong bloodline. The world moved on, democracy rose, science revealed the dangers of inbreeding, and cousin marriages, once the foundation of empires, became taboo. Today, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were third cousins, a faint echo of the past. But now, such unions are rare. Modern monarchs marry commoners, actors, aristocrats from distant lands. The blood economy has been replaced by love, or at least the appearance of it. But still, if you look closely at the old portraits, the sharp jaws, the hollow eyes, the children who never lived to adulthood, you can see the cost. The blood economy preserved power, but it demanded a price. And as you close the genealogical chart, blowing out the candle, the room fills with darkness. The quill rests. The parchment is still. And somewhere in the silence, you hear the faint echo of a wedding vow, spoken not in love, but in duty. I take thee, my cousin, to have and to hold for the sake of the crown. Rest now, archivist. The records are filed, the story is told, and the blood at last is quiet. Now, as the soft hush of the library settles deeper around you, the candlelight flickering like a drowsy guardian over the ancient ledger before you, we drift from the cold stone corridors of Habsburg ambition into the mist-laden halls of Tudor England, where ambition wore a velvet mask, and the throne was won not just by swords, but by blood. You are still the archivist, still ink-stained and silent, your fingers tracing the vellum as though reading Braille in the dark, following the winding path of a dynasty born from war, forged in marriage, and haunted by the ghosts of its own making. The air here is different, thicker with the scent of rosemary strewn across the floor, damp wool from cloaks left by courtiers, and the faint sweetness of spiced ale warming in a copper chafing dish nearby. Outside, the Thames breathes its damp fog through the latticed windows, muffling the world beyond, while inside, the only sounds are the crackle of sea coal in the brazier, the distant pluck of a lute playing a slow galliard, and the whisper of your own breath as you lean closer to the page. This is Hampton Court in the early 1500s, or perhaps the stillness of Whitehall at twilight, where power was whispered behind tapestried walls and heirs were weighed not by health but by lineage. The Tudors ruled from 1485 to 1603, a mere century in the grand sweep of history, yet their reign was a tempest of religious upheaval, royal marriages and succession crises, all of which were shaped by the quiet, recurring thread of cousin unions that looped back like ivy around a crumbling tower. You, the archivist, turn the page of the genealogical roll, its vellum curling at the edges from centuries of handling, and there it unfolds, the Tudor tree, not a towering oak, but a twisted, thorny vine, trained to bear the fruit of legitimacy, yet often yielding only sickness, sorrow, and silence. The story begins not with a king, but with a marriage, Henry VII to Elizabeth of York in 1486, a union that stitched together the warring houses of Lancaster and York after the bloody decades of the Wars of the Roses, and in doing so laid the foundation for a dynasty built on the careful blending of cousin blood. Elizabeth was Henry's third cousin, both descending from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and her hand in marriage was not just a romantic gesture, but a political masterstroke, symbolised by the creation of the Tudor rose, half red, half white, forever entwined. Their children, Arthur, Margaret, and the future Henry VIII, were raised in a court where the shadow of civil war still lingered, and where the survival of the crown depended on producing strong, uncontested heirs. Arthur, the eldest, was betrothed at the age of 3 to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and married her at 15 in a lavish ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, where the air was thick with incense, saffron-scented candles, and the weight of expectation. But Arthur died just months later, leaving Catherine a widow and the succession hanging by a thread. until Henry VII made the fateful decision to have his second son, the young Henry, marry his brother's widow, a move that required a papal dispensation due to biblical prohibitions against such unions. When Henry VIII finally ascended the throne in 1509, he did so as the husband of his brother's widow, a woman who was not only his sister-in-law, but also distantly related through earlier Iberian royal intermarriages, making her, in the quiet reckoning of bloodlines, another cousin in the grand design. For nearly 2 decades, Henry and Catherine tried in vain to produce a male heir, their marriage strained by the deaths of stillborn sons, phantom pregnancies, and the ever-present fear of dynastic collapse. Catherine gave birth to Mary in 1516, but no surviving prince followed, and as the years passed, Henry's desperation grew, not from lack of love, but from the terrifying prospect of what would happen if the Tudor line failed. Another civil war, another scramble for the crown, the undoing of everything his father had built, and so the king turned his gaze elsewhere, first to Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting with dark eyes and a sharp wit, whose family, the Howards, traced their own descent from Edward III, making her a distant cousin to the Tudors through the old Plantagenet lines. Their marriage in 1533, conducted in secret and later declared invalid by Rome, shattered England's ties to the Catholic Church and birthed the Church of England, all in the name of producing a legitimate male heir. When Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, not the hoped-for son, her fate was sealed, and soon she stood on the scaffold, her cousinly blood no protection against the king's wrath. Next came Jane Seymour, whose family also carried Plantagenet ancestry, and who finally gave Henry his longed-for son, Edward, in 1537, only to die days later from childbed fever, her triumph as brief as a candle flame in a draughty hall. And still, the pattern held. Each wife, each union, was not chosen solely for beauty or affection, but for the doors her ancestry could open, the claims she could strengthen, the blood she could purify. Even Anne of Cleves, brought from Germany in 1540, was selected not for love, but because her Lutheran family offered a strategic alliance against the Catholic powers of Europe. And yes, because she was distantly related to the Habsburgs, and thus, by the tangled web of European royalty, another cousin in the grand design. When Henry found her unattractive and annulled the marriage within months, it was not just a personal rejection, but a political recalibration, a reminder that even in marriage, the Tudor crown came first. His final wives, Catherine Howard, another Howard cousin with ties to the old nobility, and Catherine Parr, a learned woman who survived by outliving him, were part of the same relentless cycle, women whose value was measured in heirs, alliances, and blood. But the cost of this obsession with lineage and legitimacy was etched not just in the scaffold's shadow, but in the bodies and minds of the Tudor children themselves. Henry VIII, once the golden youth of the court, a jouster and poet, grew bloated and ill in his later years, his legs ulcerated, his temper volatile. Some historians suggest syphilis, others a rare genetic disorder like MacLeod syndrome, but it is also possible that the cumulative effect of generations of cousin marriages, beginning with his parents, had begun to surface in his own deteriorating health. His son Edward VI, born to Jane Seymour, was a sickly child from the start, his frail constitution evident in portraits that show a boy too thin for his rich velvets, his face pale beneath the weight of the crown. He ruled for only 6 years before dying at 15, likely of tuberculosis or a congenital respiratory condition, his last days spent in a feverish haze at Greenwich Palace, the air thick with the scent of chamomile and vinegar-soaked cloths pressed to his brow. His sister Mary, born to Catherine of Aragon, inherited not only her mother's Catholic faith, but also her poor eyesight and recurring illnesses, suffering from what may have been ovarian cysts or phantom pregnancies, conditions that left her unable to produce an heir and deepened the crisis of succession. And then there was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would reign longer than any of them, a queen of brilliance and caution, yet even she bore the marks of her lineage. Her fingers often twisted her handkerchief in moments of stress. her courtiers whispering of her anxiety, her refusal to marry, perhaps not just a political calculation, but a quiet rebellion against the marital machinery that had consumed her mother, her stepmothers, and her sister. The Tudor court, for all its splendour, its masks, its music, its sugar sculptures and silken gowns, was a place of profound isolation. Royal children were raised not as siblings but as rivals, their nurseries filled with governesses who taught them heraldry before letters, their toys miniature crowns and sceptres, their futures already mapped by the quill of the genealogist. Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's daughter, was married off to James IV of Scotland in 1503, a union meant to unite the crowns, and though she found some happiness, her descendants, including Mary, Queen of Scots, would become both heirs and threats to the English throne, their cousinly blood making them legitimate claimants and thus dangerous. Mary, raised in France, married her cousin Lord Darnley, another Stuart with Tudor ties, and bore a son, James, who would eventually inherit the English crown after Elizabeth's death, completing a circle drawn in blood and betrayal. The Tudor tree, for all its twists, ultimately bore no direct fruit. Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the last of her line, and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, a cousin whose own legitimacy was rooted in the same tangled web of unions that had defined the century. And yet, even in its end, the dynasty's legacy lingered, not in heirs, but in the quiet anomalies that whispered of a deeper cost. The frailty of the children, the mental instability of Mary, the physical decline of Henry, the barrenness that haunted so many of the queens, these were not mere misfortunes, but symptoms of a system that prioritized blood over biology, legitimacy over life. The Tudors had avoided the extreme inbreeding of the Habsburgs, but they still played the cousin marriage game, weaving their lineage tightly enough to feel the strain. There were no protruding jaws or epileptic fits, but there was a fragility in the line, a sense that the crown sat uneasily on heads weakened by the very blood that was supposed to strengthen them, as you, the archivist, close the genealogical roll and dip your quill one last time into the inkwell. The candle burns low, its flame trembling in the stillness. The lute has fallen silent. The fire is ash. And outside, the first light of dawn begins to seep through the mist, soft and silver over the Thames. The Tudor story is over, its triumphs and tragedies, its marriages and murders, its desperate grasp for continuity. You rest your head on the cool wood of the desk, the scent of parchment and beeswax filling your senses, and for a moment you see them all. Henry in his gilded armour, Mary in her widow's black, Elizabeth beneath the great ruff of her coronation gown, their faces not so much different from one another, their eyes holding the same fierce, haunted light. Cousins all, and in the end the blood that bound them also broke them. Rest now, archivist, the page is turned, the tale is told, and the silence returns deeper than before. You've now drifted from the mist-laden corridors of Tudor England, where ambition wore a veil of piety and succession hung by the thread of a male heir, into the luminous, gilded halls of Versailles, where sunlight is not just a dawn phenomenon, but a philosophy. It is the late 17th century, the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and you, the archivist, have followed the scent of beeswax and orange blossom into a world where every mirror reflects not just a face, but a dynasty. The air here is thick with the perfume of myrrh and the faint sweetness of pomanders, oranges studded with cloves, tucked into silk pouches and worn at the waist to mask the ever-present musk of unwashed bodies beneath layers of brocade. You sit at a delicate inlaid desk in a quiet alcove of the palace, your fingers brushing the edge of a vellum genealogical chart that unfurls like a silk banner across the polished mahogany. Candles burn in silver sconces, their flames multiplying endlessly in the hall of mirrors, casting a soft, flickering glow that dances across the fleur-de-lis embroidered into the tapestries. A distant viol consort plays a sarabande, its notes slow and honeyed, drifting through the corridors like incense. While outside, The fountains of the gardens pulse in rhythmic time, their waters catching the last light of day. This is Versailles, less a palace, more a stage for absolutism, where power was not just held, but performed, and where the royal family's bloodlines were cultivated like rare flowers in a royal garden, carefully pruned, grafted, and interwoven to preserve their brilliance. And so we turn our gaze to the Bourbon bouquet. A family tree not of sprawling oaks, but of delicate interlaced vines, where cousin marriages were not scandal, but statecraft, and where the fragrance of legitimacy masked the faint rot of genetic decay. Let us trace these vines, slowly, softly, as the fire crackles low and the world beyond the palace walls fades into silence. The Bourbons ruled France from 1589, when Henry IV ascended the throne after the turbulent wars of religion, until the monarchy's collapse in the French Revolution over 2 centuries later. Their rise was born of compromise. Henry IV, a Protestant turned Catholic, famously declared, "Paris is worth a mass." But his reign also set a precedent for a new kind of royal strategy, one that valued blood alliances over battlefield victories. Like the Habsburgs before them, the Bourbons understood that marriage was the most elegant weapon in the arsenal of empire. But where the Habsburgs were blunt in their inbreeding, the Bourbons were more refined, their unions often appearing diplomatic while quietly reinforcing the purity of their lineage. You trace your quill along the parchment, following the looping lines that connect Louis XIII to Anne of Austria, his first cousin once removed, both grandchildren of Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth of Valois, whose marriage in 1615 at the Cathedral of Bordeaux was a masterpiece of political botany. The air that day was thick with frankincense and the scent of lilies, the stained glass casting jewel-toned light across the stone floor, while nobles whispered of the Habsburg blood now flowing into the French line. Their union was barren for years, a source of national anxiety, until the long-awaited birth of Louis XIV in 1638. A child so miraculous he was dubbed Dieudonné, God-given, born not just to a queen, but to a dynasty on the brink of extinction. And yet, even this saviour of the line was the product of cousinly blood, his parents' shared ancestry tightening the vine that would soon stretch across Europe. Louis XIV, the Sun King, became the living embodiment of Bourbon power, his reign lasting 72 years, the longest of any monarch in European history. He did not merely rule, he radiated. His court at Versailles was a machine of spectacle, designed to awe and immobilize rivals, to make the nobility dance themselves into submission. But behind the gilded facade, the same quiet strategy of cousin marriage continued, now elevated to an art form. In 1660, Louis married his double first cousin, Maria Theresa of Spain, the daughter of his maternal uncle, Philip IV of Spain, and his paternal aunt, Elizabeth of France. Their shared grandparents were King Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, making their union a full-circle moment in the Habsburg-Bourbon entanglement. The wedding, held on the Isle of Pheasants in the Pyrenees, a neutral territory between France and Spain, was a diplomatic triumph, sealing the Treaty of the Pyrenees and ending decades of war. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms, their fragrance carried on the breeze from Spanish groves, while trumpets blared and priests chanted Te Deum beneath a velvet-draped altar. Maria Theresa, dressed in silver brocade, was a political prize, her dowry vast, but it was never paid, a technicality that Louis would later use to justify war. Yet more than politics, this marriage was a biological pact. A promise that the blood of the Bourbons and Habsburgs would merge, their crowns united through progeny. Their children, it was hoped, would inherit not just France and Spain, but the very sun itself. But the vine, though beautiful, was fragile. Of their 6 children, only one survived to adulthood, Louis the Grand Dauphin. The others, Anne-Elisabeth, Marie-Anne, Louis, Philippe, And another Louis died in infancy or early childhood, their tiny bodies laid to rest in the crypts of Saint-Denis, their names whispered only in prayer. The nursery at Versailles, with its gilded cradles and silk coverlets, became a house of mourning, the air thick with the scent of chamomile and willow bark, the physician's remedies as bitter as the grief. The Grand Dauphin, though he lived, was a sickly child, his constitution weakened by fevers and digestive ailments, his pallor a quiet testament to the cost of inbreeding. When he married his cousin Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria in 1680, the knot tightened further. Another cousin union, another layer of genetic concentration. Their son, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, married his cousin Maria Adelaide of Savoy in 1697, and from this branch came Louis XV, who ascended the throne at the age of 5 after the deaths of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather within a single year. Louis XV, known as the Beloved in his youth, grew into a king plagued by illness, frequent colds, respiratory troubles, and a general frailty that suggested the Bourbon blood had grown thin, its vitality sapped by generations of closed loops. His court, though still dazzling, carried a whisper of decline. The mirrors reflected not just splendour, but the ghost of a dying line. You, the archivist, pause and dip your quill again, the ink glistening like dark sap. The sensory world of Versailles surrounds you, the soft creak of floorboards under velvet slippers, the distant chime of a clock marking the hour, the faint rustle of a page turning a psalter in a nearby chapel. A servant glides past with a tray of Hippocras wine, its cinnamon and clove scent curling through the air, while a harpsichord plays a gentle air in the grand gallery, its notes echoing like falling leaves. Yet beneath this opulence, a quieter truth lingers. The Bourbons, like the Habsburgs, were playing a dangerous game. By marrying cousins, first, second, double first, they preserved their divine right, their wealth, their exclusivity. But they also concentrated recessive genes, inviting haemophilia, epilepsy, and immune deficiencies into the royal blood. The Spanish Bourbons, descended from Philip V, Louis XIV's grandson, would later suffer from the same frailties: mental instability, early deaths, and the unmistakable signs of inbreeding depression. Charles III of Spain, a Bourbon king of Naples and Sicily, married his cousin Maria Amalia of Saxony in 1738, and their children bore the marks: weak lungs, stillbirths, and a general lack of vigour. The bouquet was blooming, but the roots were rotting, and yet the court never stopped. The rituals continued, the masks, the ballets, the endless rounds of etiquette, all performed with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, as if sheer will could stave off decay. The isolation of these royal children was profound. Raised in a world of mirrors and whispers, their playmates were often their future spouses, their lullabies sung in languages they barely understood. Maria Theresa of Spain, upon arriving at Versailles, was surrounded by French ladies-in-waiting who replaced her Spanish retinue, their chatter a wall of sound she could not penetrate. Her wedding night, spent in a canopied bed draped with damask, was not a consummation of love, but a ritual of state, the air heavy with lavender oil and the weight of expectation. She bore children, yes, but also loneliness, her solitude a quiet counterpoint to the palace's glittering noise. The Bourbon heirs, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, grew up in this gilded cage, their lives mapped before they could walk, their marriages arranged before they could dream. By the time of Louis XVI, the vine had grown brittle. He married Marie Antoinette, a Habsburg princess, his second cousin, and though their union was not between close kin, it was still a continuation of the old pattern, a marriage of dynastic convenience, not affection. Their children suffered. Marie-Thérèse, the only one to survive the revolution, was born into a court already trembling. The physicians, still ignorant of genetics, blamed the royal ailments on humours, on the damp air of the palace, on divine punishment. They bled the sick with leeches, fed them mercury and laudanum, burned herbs to purify the air. But no remedy could fix a genome strained by centuries of cousin unions. When the revolution came in 1789, it did not just topple a king, it uprooted an entire system, one that had lived too long on borrowed time. Its power built on blood, but its foundation crumbling from within. As you close the genealogical roll, the candle flickers low, its flame dancing like a final saraband. The music has faded, the fountains are still, and outside, the first light of dawn begins to bleed through the garden mist. The bourbon bouquet, so radiant, so carefully cultivated, has wilted at last. Its petals were gilded, its scent intoxicating, but its roots were tangled in a soil too narrow to sustain it. Rest now, archivist. The page is turned, the story is told, and the silence returns, deeper than before. You've now drifted from the gilded, sun-drenched halls of Versailles, where mirrors reflected not just faces but centuries of carefully cultivated lineage, into a colder, quieter realm, the snow-laced corridors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where frost gathers on the inside of the windows, and the air carries the faint, resinous scent of burning pine from iron stoves tucked into every corner. It is the late 19th century, the reign of Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, and you, the archivist, have followed the scent of old ink and beeswax candles into a world where power was not just inherited, but haunted. You sit at a small inlaid desk near a curtained alcove, your breath visible in the dim candlelight, the genealogical chart before you stretching across the table like a frozen river, its lines branching, looping, and ultimately vanishing into darkness. The silence here is different from that of Versailles or Hampton Court. It is not the hush of opulence, but the stillness before a storm. Outside, the Neva River lies thick with ice, and the occasional crunch of a guard's boot on snow echoes like a heartbeat through the frozen city. Inside, the only sounds are the soft crackle of the stove, the distant chime of a clock marking midnight, and the whisper of your own quill as it traces the names of a dynasty undone not by war or rebellion alone, but by the quiet, invisible hand of blood. The Romanovs ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917, a span of 3 centuries marked by imperial ambition, cultural transformation, and an ever-deepening entanglement with the royal families of Western Europe. Unlike the Habsburgs, who inbred with ruthless consistency, or the Tudors, who danced around cousin unions with political precision, the Romanovs took a different path, one of imported blood. They married German, Danish and British cousins, weaving their lineage into the broader tapestry of European royalty. And in doing so, they unknowingly invited a curse into their nursery, a riddle written not in ink but in DNA. You trace your finger along the chart, past the stern portraits of czars in fur-trimmed cloaks and double-headed eagles embroidered in gold thread until you reach the fateful union of Nicholas II and Princess Alix of Hesse, later known as Alexandra Fyodorovna. Their marriage in 1894 was a grand affair held in the glittering Winter Palace, where the air was thick with the scent of myrrh from swinging censers and the deep, resonant chants of the Orthodox choir echoing beneath gilded domes. Alexandra, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was not just a foreign bride. She was a carrier of a silent, devastating trait, haemophilia. The royal disease, as it came to be known, had already spread through Victoria's descendants, appearing in Spain, Germany, and Prussia. But it was in the Romanov nursery that it struck with the most tragic force. Their son, Alexei, born in 1904, inherited the condition, a single faulty gene passed down through the female line. Haemophilia meant his blood could not clot properly. A simple fall, a bumped knee, even a loose tooth could send him into agonizing, life-threatening bleeding episodes. You imagine the nursery now, dimly lit, heavy with the scent of camphor and medicinal herbs, nurses in starched white caps moving like shadows, their footsteps muffled on thick Persian rugs. The boy, small and pale, lies in a carved wooden bed, his legs wrapped in bandages, his cries soft but persistent, while his mother kneels beside him, clutching a silver icon, her lips moving in silent prayer. The air is thick with fear, because every bleed could be the last. And in that fear, a mystic named Rasputin rises, his long beard and piercing eyes casting an even longer shadow over the imperial family. He claims to heal Alexei with prayer and presence, and strangely, when he is near, the bleeding stops. Whether by placebo, psychology, or some unspoken understanding of rest and restraint, the court comes to believe in him. But his influence, his midnight visits, his whispered counsel to the Tsarina, fuels whispers of scandal, of corruption, of a dynasty rotting from within. And yet the true rot was not moral, but genetic. The Romanovs, in their attempt to strengthen their bloodline through European alliances, had opened the door to a vulnerability they could not see. Alexandra was not just a cousin to other royals, she was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and thus deeply entangled in the same web of intermarriage that had weakened the Habsburgs and shadowed the Bourbons. Her marriage to Nicholas was not a union of distant branches, but another knot in the same ancient tree. The Romanovs had long married cousins. Peter III wed his cousin Catherine the Great. Paul III married his cousin Sophie of Württemberg. But now, the consequences were no longer subtle. They were visible. They were bleeding. You turn the page of the genealogy, the parchment cold under your fingers. The riddle of the Romanovs was not just haemophilia, but isolation. Alexandra, though born a princess, was never truly accepted by the Russian court. Her German accent, her reliance on Rasputin, her withdrawal from public life to tend to Alexei, all marked her as an outsider. The people whispered that she was a spy, that Rasputin controlled the throne, that the Tsar was weak because his wife was foreign and his son was cursed. The palace, for all its splendour, its Fabergé eggs, its crystal chandeliers, its furs and icons, became a prison of silence and fear. The children were raised in a world of ritual and restriction, their playtime monitored, their friendships limited to siblings and distant cousins. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, the four Grand Duchesses, grew up in near seclusion, their diaries filled with sketches of dolls and dreams of normalcy, while Alexei's health hung over every celebration like a storm cloud. The strategic logic behind these marriages was clear. By tying the Romanovs to other royal houses, they ensured alliances, legitimacy, and continuity. Peter the Great had opened Russia to the West, and each generation since had deepened that connection. But the cost was a growing disconnect from the Russian people. While the court spoke French, danced waltzes, and celebrated Easter with champagne and caviar, the peasants starved, the soldiers froze in the trenches of World War I, and the cities seethed with unrest. The Romanovs were not just inbred, they were out of touch. And when the revolution came in 1917, it did not come as a surprise. It came as a reckoning. You close your eyes for a moment, the candlelight flickering behind your lids. You see them now, not as icons, but as a family. Nicholas, gentle and indecisive, reading alone in his study. Alexandra, pacing in her chambers, clutching a letter from Victoria. Alexei, laughing briefly as his sisters pull him on a sled across the palace courtyard, only to collapse moments later in pain. Their fate was sealed not by a single decision, but by centuries of quiet choices, marrying cousins, trusting blood over bond, believing that divine right could protect them from human frailty. In 1918, they were taken to a basement in Ekaterinburg. The air there was damp, the walls stained with mildew, the only light from a single bulb swinging on a wire. The family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children and a few loyal servants, were told to stand against the wall. Then the firing squad entered. The room filled with smoke, the sound of gunfire echoing like thunder in a cave. When it was over, the bodies were doused in sulfuric acid and dumped in a forest pit. The dynasty that had ruled for over 300 years ended not with a coronation, but with a massacre. And yet, the riddle remains. Because in 2007, the remains of Alexei and one sister were found, confirming what history had long suspected. The boy had haemophilia B, a rare genetic disorder passed through his mother's line. Science had finally solved the mystery that had haunted the Romanovs. Their downfall was not just political, but biological. They were not cursed by God, but betrayed by blood. As you lay down your quill, the candle burns low, its flame trembling like a final breath. The Winter Palace is silent now. The snow falls without sound, and the genealogical chart, so carefully drawn, so full of names and lines, ends in emptiness. The Romanov riddles of power, of blood, of faith and folly are not just a story of one family, but a warning etched in history. For in the end, no dynasty can survive if its roots are poisoned, no matter how bright the crown may shine. Rest now, archivist. The page is turned, the tale is told, and the snow keeps falling, covering all traces of the past. The Habsburg jaw was not a curse, but a recessive trait amplified by generations of inbreeding. And so, the great dynasties began to fall. The French Revolution swept away the Bourbons, not just because of inequality, but because a king who married his cousin and ruled by divine right no longer made sense in a world that valued reason. The Romanovs were executed in abasement, their isolation and detachment from the people made worse by their insular marriages. The Habsburgs collapsed after World War I, their empire too fragmented, their bloodline too weak to hold it together. Today, the echoes remain, but the loops have loosened. Queen Elizabeth II married Prince Philip, her third cousin, a faint echo of the past, but their children married commoners. Prince William wed Catherine Middleton, a woman with no royal blood. The modern monarchy survives not by blood, but by image, by service, by love. And yet, in the quiet corners of European nobility, the old patterns linger. Minor haemophilia, rare genetic conditions, the occasional protruding jaw, whispers of a time when marriage was not about the heart, but about the ledger. As you, the archivist, close the final genealogical roll, the fire has gone out. The candles are spent. The room is dark, but for the first light of dawn creeping through the high windows, pale and silver over the frost-covered moors. You lay down your quill, your hands cold, your mind full of names and faces, of Henrys and Edwards, of Louis and Nicholases, of queens who wept in silence and kings who ruled with jaws too heavy to close. You think of the cost, the children who never lived, the minds that broke, the empires that rose on the back of a single repeated marriage and fell just as quickly. And yet there is peace in the silence. The world moved on. Science illuminated the dark. Love slowly reclaimed the throne. Rest now, archivist. The story is told. The trees have been traced. The knots, the bouquets, the riddles, the thorns, they are part of the past, and you, weary dreamer, may finally sleep. You've now wandered from the snow-laden silence of the Winter Palace, where the Romanovs' fate hung on a single fragile gene, into the colder, draftier corridors of a 14th century English keep, perhaps Windsor or Kenilworth, where the wind howls through arrow slits and the scent of wood smoke and damp wool lingers in the air. You are still the archivist, still ink-stained and silent, your fingers tracing the final chapters of Europe's great dynasties as the fire in the hearth crackles low, sending embers spiralling like falling leaves into the dark. Before you lies the last genealogical roll, its vellum worn thin from centuries of handling, its ink faded but still legible, like whispers from a time when blood was law and cousin marriages were not just common, but necessary. This is the Plantagenet puzzle. A thorny thicket of lineage, where kings married their cousins, brothers turned on brothers, and the crown passed not by merit, but by the twist of a shared ancestor. and beyond it, we glimpse the vile legacy of loops. How these tangled trees shaped not just empires, but the very way we understand power, inheritance, and survival. The Plantagenets ruled England from 1154 to 1485, a span of over 3 centuries marked by crusades, civil wars, and a relentless obsession with bloodline. Unlike the Habsburgs, who inbred to preserve empire, or the Bourbons, who married to project power, the Plantagenets used cousin unions to survive. Their tree was not a knot, nor a bouquet, nor a riddle. It was a battlefield. At its heart stood Edward III, whose 8 sons and 5 daughters seeded a dynasty so vast it soon turned on itself. His sons, Edward the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, married cousins, nieces, and foreign princesses with Plantagenet ties, weaving a web so dense that by the 15th century every claimant to the throne was, in some way, a cousin. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, were not a war of nations but of kin. Lancaster versus York, cousins in armour charging across fields like Towton and Bosworth, their banners emblazoned with red and white roses, their blood already mingled by generations of marriage. Henry VI, a Lancastrian, was weak, possibly mentally ill, his condition perhaps inherited from his French Valois ancestors through his mother Catherine of Valois, who had married her cousin. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, was a distant cousin too. Their union meant to strengthen ties to France, but instead fueling division. When Henry collapsed during council meetings, his mind lost to silence, the throne trembled. And across the realm, Richard, Duke of York, pressed his claim, because he too was a grandson of Edward III, and thus a cousin with a crown in his blood. The air of those times was thick with fear and incense. In cathedrals, priests chanted for divine intervention. In castles, barons whispered over maps, their fingers tracing duchies and earldoms like pieces on a chessboard. The nursery, once a place of lullabies, became a political chamber where a child's birth could spark a war and a child's death could end a line. Edward IV, a Yorkist king, married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, breaking the pattern, yet even she had distant Plantagenet blood, and their children, the princes in the Tower, vanished under the watch of their uncle Richard III, who then married his first cousin once removed, Anne Neville, tightening the Yorkist claim. Richard himself, long rumoured to be hunched and cruel, was later confirmed by archaeology to have scoliosis, possibly a sign of genetic strain from generations of cousin marriages, though his villainy was likely exaggerated by the victorious Tudors. And then, at last, the thicket was pruned. In 1485, Henry Tudor, himself a Lancastrian descendant through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, defeated Richard at Bosworth. He did not just win the crown, he married it. He wed Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses in a single bloodline, their children bearing the Tudor rose, half red, half white, forever entwined. It was the end of the Plantagenet puzzle and the beginning of a new myth, that peace could be forged not on battlefields, but in the quiet act of a cousin's hand in marriage. But as the centuries passed, the world changed. The Enlightenment dawned, and with it came science. Charles Darwin, in the 19th century, studied inbreeding in plants and warned of its dangers. His cousin, Francis Galton, founded eugenics, not as a tool of oppression, but as a study of heredity. For the first time, the royal family's secret, centuries of cousin marriages, was examined not as divine will, but as biological risk. Haemophilia, once called the royal disease, was traced through Queen Victoria's descendants, appearing in Spain, Germany, and Russia, all because a single mutation had been passed down through cousin unions. The Romanovs' tragedy was not just political, it was genetic.